It's going to be a good sermon, so I need space to move. Okay. All right, Exodus chapter 15. This is right after our passage last week. We were reading in Exodus 14, and then I read some of the song that they sang in celebration after the Red Sea, after God parted the sea for them. And if you remember, we had a standoff between Moses, as played by Charlton Heston, as played by Ben Lamone, against Pharaoh, as played by Yul Brynner, as played by George Parada. So we had that awesome moment, but we discovered who is the hero of the story. It is not Moses, it is God, right? He is the one at work in our lives. Our life is a lot easier, okay? I'm not saying it's easy. Our life is a lot easier if we recognize we are not the hero of our own story. Amen? Amen. Okay, so right after this, all right, they finish singing their song. The women keep singing their song. They go back into the reprise. They're singing and dancing with the tambourines, all right? Then verse 22 of chapter 15. Then Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled in this desert for 3 days without finding any water. Circle the words 3 days, okay? 3 days, that's all it was. When they came to the oasis of Marah, the place was too bitter to drink. So they called the place Marah, which means bitter. Then the people complained and turned against Moses. "What are we going to drink?" they demanded. So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good to drink. It was there at Marah that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. He said, "If you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands, keeping all his decrees, then I will not make you suffer any of the decrees I sent on the Egyptians. For I am the Lord who heals you." After leaving Marah, the Israelites traveled on to the oasis of Elim, where they found 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They camped there beside the water. So they have just been delivered from the Red Sea. They got out of slavery, and God realizes very clearly that if they go straight into battle, they're going to turn around and run right back to slavery. Okay? Singing the song, "I Hear the Chains Falling," is incredibly appropriate when you're talking about the book of Exodus, because the idea is getting out of the bondage place, right? Getting out of the things that hold you down, that entangle you, that trap you, that keep you stuck in an environment or a state of mind or anything that is not good for you, okay? So they hit the Red Sea. God tells Moses, "Pick up your stick and hold it out." The waters part. They get through on dry ground. Then all of the Egyptians that are the army that's coming after them and all the chariots and horses get into the Red Sea. They're on the dry ground. God says, "Lift the stick again." Waters crash down. They're all dead. Okay? 3 days later. That's all the farther we've gone at this point. Keep in mind, this could have been just an 11-day journey. That's how long it took to get from Egypt to the actual geography of the Promised Land. God's taking them in this roundabout way because he knows they're not ready, that he's got to do some preparation work for them. So they have just faced a big body of water. It's problematic, and God fixes it, right? That's what just happened 3 days ago. Have you ever looked at someone and said, "I just said that"? Have you ever been in a meeting and you really bring up a really great idea? It's a fantastic idea. It is inspired. And you give that idea and everybody's like, "I don't know if that's going to work, whatever." You move on. Somebody else says the same thing. You're like, seriously? My idea, I just said that. Can you imagine God at this point? Big body of water. It's problematic. What do you think is going to happen? So they have this miracle. They have this supernatural experience. They hit the desert. For 3 days, they're feeling lost. There's no water. First, they had too much water in their way, right? The Red Sea. Now they don't have enough water in their view. And after 3 days, they come to this oasis in the desert. They're thirsty, they're tired, quite frankly, they're whiny. They could have been halfway there by now. So pace yourselves, right? And God provides. God provides. Here's the oasis. You're right, you're not there yet, but at least you're somewhere. You've been in the desert for 3 days with no water. So at least you are somewhere. Water, at last, except it's bitter. It's spoiled. It's not good. Have you ever been walking through your life and you're kind of puzzled to why everything seems to be taking so long? I could be halfway there by now. Like you hit a certain milestone age and then you look at somebody else and what they've achieved by that age and you think you should have achieved so much more by now. Have you ever gotten to a place where you think you've arrived at the desert or you've arrived at the oasis in the desert? You're like, yes, somewhere. It's not the promised land, but at least it's somewhere, and then it's not as good as you thought it was going to be. Seriously, God? You brought me out of slavery just to die of thirst in the middle of the desert? You brought me out of that position just to give me a boss that's worse than the one before? You brought me out of that year just to feel like I'm starting all over again? You brought me out of that bad relationship just for me to feel so lonely now? You brought me out of debt just to have my car totaled and there goes the emergency fund? Seriously, God? Now, the name Mara shows up somewhere else in the Bible in a story that I love. And it's just a few books over in the book of Ruth. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. What's next? Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, okay? So if you go a little bit over to Luke chapter 1, you have the story of Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth, okay? And Naomi is a woman who had a husband, had a great life, had sons, had daughter-in-laws, so like everything is turning out promising at this point. And then there's famine, and then there's death, and now she is left with one daughter-in-law. She has no husband, she has no sons to provide for her in her widowhood, and her daughter-in-law, they're all widows, so she tells them to like go back to your homeland, because I can't support you, so go back to your families and they'll understand and they'll support you and you'll marry again and then you'll be taken care of, but I have no one. I'm just bitter, right? So in Ruth chapter 1, verse 20 and 21, Naomi says this, don't call me Naomi. So this is after Ruth says, no, I'm going to stick with you. I will go wherever you go. Your God is going to be my God. I'm going to stay with you. God is calling me to this. So they go back to Naomi's homeland. And all of the people are excited to see her. They're like, Naomi, is that you? Like, that's what they literally say. Is this really Naomi? The women call. Don't call me Naomi, she responded. Instead, call me Mara. For the Almighty has made my life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has set such tragedy upon me? She is a very upset, grumpy, bitter old lady. And so she says, no. Don't call me pleasant. That's what Naomi means. Call me Mara, bitter. It's the same as what they called the place with the bitter water. See, when we define ourselves by the circumstances of our journey instead of the circumstances of our destination, we become bitter instead of better. I'll just let it sink in for a sec. The conversation with a dear friend this week about God's timing, how God exists outside of our definition and version of time and how we exist. We were talking about messes in our lives. I always say God is not the author of your mess, he is an artist in your mess. But this dear friend and I were talking about how God prepares for our mess before we even create it sometimes. This woman who had a good reason to feel bitter. Naomi had no one to take care of her. She had lost everyone that was precious to her. The only person she had with her also had zero way of providing for them. So now she's going to go home to her people, and she's like, no, I'm not pleasant anymore. I'm just bitter. And she is utterly honest. Utterly honest. And in some ways, I have to admire the level of honesty that she has. She's like, no, this is God's fault. Now, she's wrong, but she is honest about it, okay? So at least she is in a somewhat honest place. She just doesn't understand the consequences of natural sin in our lives. And so she's there, and she's just bitter. She didn't cause any of this stuff to happen, and she's just trying to figure out why or who to blame. And when we get stuck in the circumstances of our journey, and we get stuck in the thoughts of what we're coming out of, instead of what God's taking us into, we will sit there and we will camp there, and we will also say, just call me bitter. And God's showing us, no. That's not who you are. That's not who you need to be. See, God has already set the things in motion for Naomi, and she has no idea. Before you even get yourself into your own mess, He's preparing a way for you to see His glory through it. Were those people slaves of Egypt? No, they were people of promise. Was Naomi meant to be a bitter, cranky old woman? No. God had a redeemer named Boaz who was going to marry Ruth. They were going to have a baby named Obed that Naomi would carry her grandbaby and care for him as if he were her own, the Bible says. And guess what? Baby Obed grows up. He has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David, the really famous one. King David, the guy who defeated the Goliath giant. The guy who the Bible says was a man after God's own heart. The man whose descendant and line would be where Jesus was born into. She wasn't meant to be bitter. Are you defined by your past mistakes? Are you renaming yourself? Or naming your place and where you are in life bitterness? Are you saying, this is what someone else has done to me? It's not my fault. And you might be right. It's not. But it's happened. Are you trying to figure out blame or don't know what to do, and you're just trying to say, well, maybe I should just go back to where I was? Yeah, it was bondage, but at least I was well fed and I had enough water. No. That's not what defines you. That's not the name God's spoken over your life. See, you're a child of God. You're a co-heir with Christ. And as Jesus' followers, you have an eternity in heaven. When we define ourselves by the circumstances of our journey instead of the circumstances of our destination, we become bitter instead of better. What's your destination? Is it separated from God, or is it with Him for all of eternity? I'm a Christian. It means I'm a follower of a Jesus. And Jesus said that means I am a co-heir, that I am adopted in to the family line. That means God has a plan and a purpose and the provision for it. And even when I'm in a place that the circumstances right now look bitter, God has something better. And that's what defines me. That's what defines me. See, remember what we've said from week 1 of this series. True deliverance is not about the road out. It is about the road in. It's not just what you're coming out of. It's where God's taking you, where He has this path headed for you. I had this professor in college, Dr. Bill. Every single word that Dr. Bill said in a class was open season on the next test, okay? So you're talking about, Dr. Bill is brilliant, okay? I don't want to talk about him, I had him in the past tense, but he's still there, still a prof. He's brilliant, Ivy educated, eccentric, weird, once wore a Superman spandex costume to a Bible class. Weird. He carries this big, heavy briefcase to class, and he rides a bike to the university every single day. So if you have him for the first class of the morning, you see him in full bike riding gear, which is just awkward, okay? And then as soon as he started the class with the quiz, because every single class started with a quiz, he would then go change into his, office clothes for the day and then come back and collect the quizzes and then start teaching. And you knew from the moment that Dr. Bill opened his mouth, you better have pen and paper ready, because anything that comes out of his mouth at any point during the class, whether it is a actual commentary on the text that we're talking about, whether it's something from the textbook. By the way, everything in the chapter is also open season for the test. Whether it's something he said in a joke or a story or illustration he told in class, it is all open season for that exam, okay? And he is so brilliant that it doesn't matter how many classes of the same class he is teaching at that time, he knows exactly what he told your class and what he did not. So on the day of an exam, he would pass out the papers to everybody, and he would say, all right, this class, you are not responsible for number 23 or number 64. Because he knew he had not said that during our classes. Absolutely nuts. I couldn't remember half of what he said when I was taking the notes, but he knew what he had told every single class on his teaching schedule. He always remembered. God is a better teacher than Dr. William Griffin. And he has a better memory than Dr. William Griffin. There are some characteristics in common. Dr. Bill was the kind of teacher that if you fell asleep in his class, two things would happen, possibly. The first possibility was that he would open up that giant, heavy, indestructible briefcase, and he would pull out a little stuffed animal, and he would walk over your desk and just sit it there in front of everybody and let you cuddle up to it during class. The second thing that would happen is that he would take a block of wood out of that giant briefcase, and he would stand right by your desk and go, "Come!" and scare the living daylights out of you so that you would wake up during his class. God has similar approaches. Sometimes he's just going to give you a little comfort. You're tired. Other times he's going to wake you up. And he remembers what he's taught you. God remembers what he said to you. Your next test is directly related to the lesson you just learned. Your next test on this journey, on your road in, to where God's taking you, what he's walking you through, the promise that he's spoken over your life and into your heart. Your next test on this road in is directly related to the lesson God has just taught you. People walk up to the Red Sea. God, we've got a water problem. God, hold the stick. 3 days later, people walk up to the water, whine. God, we've got a water problem. God shakes his head. Yeah, I said this 3 days ago. You are responsible for this on this test. Hold the stick. And Moses picks up this piece of wood, the stick that God's directed him to use. He throws it into the water, and all of a sudden, it's fine. Moses 15:25. Moses cried out to the Lord for help. The Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good to drink. Life isn't easy. It's not fair. We're not guaranteed that we get this, follow the yellow brick road and everything's going to be hunky-dory kind of life. In fact, Jesus says in John chapter 16, verse 33, I have told you this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials. Those are tests. And sorrows. But take heart, because I have overcome the world. Rich Mullins was one of my favorite songwriters before he passed away, and he paraphrased it this way: in this world you may have trouble, but I leave you my peace, that where I am, there you may also be. A focus on the past will just keep you bitter. A focus on the present leaves you myopic and short-sighted. But a focus on the destination, a focus on the future, a focus on where God is leading you next and what he has called you to, that leaves you ready for his provision. That leaves you ready for what God has for you. If you go back to Exodus 15, go to verse 25. It was there at Marah that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. Had they heard the lesson and learned it? He said, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands, keeping all his decrees, I won't make you suffer any of the diseases I sent on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. After leaving Marah, the Israelites traveled on to the oasis of Elim, where they found 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They camped there beside the water. 12 springs, can't get out that word today. 70 palm trees. It's possible that those are the exact numbers, that there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. It's possible there were a lot more than that, but they're using this beautiful symbolic poetic language of 12, which by the time anybody was reading this, they knew that there would be 12 tribes. So God's saying, I'm providing for all of the descendants. 70 palm trees. Once a disciple asked Jesus, somebody asked Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive? 70 times 7. It was the idea of abundance and more than you can count. There were 12 springs. There were 70 palm trees. There's enough for everyone, shade for everybody. Oh, you get to camp here. You get to camp here for a bit. You get to rest. You get to reflect on the lesson that you learned. And it's just a little picture of the promised land. Go ahead, the rest of the team, come on up with Ben. See, we get those pictures as well. God gives us pictures of the promise to come. He opens up the windows of heaven and says, you're on a journey. It's longer than you actually think it is. And I'm preparing you the same way I'm preparing the promise. But now that you're having to learn the lesson and then, learn it again, take a rest. See my provision. See what I'm giving you. Now, when you read in Exodus this week and you continue to read a chapter a day, the very next chapter, the next test is directly related to the lesson you have just learned. And they're going to start grumbling about provision. And they're learning a different side of that from God. They walked up to the Red Sea, felt trapped. God, we've got a water problem. It's a life or death situation here, God. And God says, hold the stick. The people walk up to the water and they're bitter. They're grumbling at this point. Felt like they're lost and in this dry, dead, desert place, because they are, for 3 days. God, we've got a water problem. It's a bit of a life or death situation here. God shakes his head. Yeah, I taught you this one 3 days ago. Hold this stick. You and I, we walk up to the water and we feel lost on our own journey. We don't know how we're going to get past this. We don't think that this is going to be good enough for us. We get to this place, we feel like, yeah, okay, cool, it's somewhere, and then it's no good. So you haven't arrived yet, and the temporary situation is just bitter. It's just bitter. God, I've got a problem. And I feel like this is a life or death situation. And God says, I know. Hold this stick. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. Hold this stick. Hold this stick. Take up your cross. It means die to self. Be willing to lay it down and say, God, I can't fix this. You can. Be willing to wade out to the water and say, God, I've got a water problem. And he'll say, I know. I can fix it. Hold the stick. Take up your cross. Follow me. If you need to let go of any bitterness today, hold on to his promise. Hold on to his promise. Because when we hold on to our cross, the only reason we take up a cross is because Jesus took up a cross. And he died there for us. He took on our sin. He took on our punishment. He took on our pain. He took on our mess. He said, I've got this. I've got this.